The hot coffee hit the guard square on the chest. It happened so fast that most people standing outside the palace gates did not even understand what they had just witnessed. 1 second, a gray-haired man in a wrinkled coat was standing at the edge of the crowd. In the next, a full cup of steaming coffee was flying through the cold London air, spinning, splashing, and landing directly on the red tunic of the royal guard, who had been standing perfectly still just moments before. The crowd froze. A woman near the front gasped and pressed both hands over her mouth. A teenage boy filming on his phone stopped mid-sentence. A tour guide who had been speaking in cheerful, rehearsed sentences about the history of Buckingham Palace fell completely silent. For a moment, the entire stretch of pavement outside the gates seemed to hold its breath. It was a Tuesday morning in early November, and the kind of biting cold that makes London feel gray right down to its bones had settled over the city. Tourists had gathered along the iron railings the way they always do, cameras raised, voices low, eyes searching for anything worth remembering. The royal guard had been standing at his post since 7 in the morning, tall and unmoving, bearskin hat sitting straight on his head, white-gloved hands gripping his rifle with the kind of discipline that takes years to build. He had stood through the wind. He had stood through the rain that came in short bursts earlier that morning. He had stood through hundreds of people pointing at him, calling out to him, snapping photos an inch from his face. He had not moved once, and he did not move now either, even as the hot brown liquid soaked through the front of his uniform. Even as the paper cup bounced off his chest and clattered onto the stone ground at his feet, he did not flinch. His jaw stayed locked. His eyes stayed straight ahead. His hands did not shift on the rifle. He stood there exactly as he had been trained to stand, still as stone, present as a mountain, unmoved by the world around him. But the man who threw it was not still at all. He stood about 6 feet away, breathing hard, his thin chest rising and falling beneath that wrinkled coat. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, with silver hair that had not been combed, deep circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, and a face that carried the kind of exhaustion that no amount of rest can fix. His hands, now empty and trembling slightly, hung at his sides. His eyes were locked on the guard, not with anger exactly, but with something harder to name, something desperate. Something that looked almost like grief trying to disguise itself as fury. People around him began to react. Someone shouted. A man near the back of the crowd told him loudly that he was disgusting. A woman with a push hair stepped sharply away. 2 tourists who had been standing right beside him moved back, pulling their children with them as if something dangerous had just been revealed. A police officer stationed further along the path had already turned and was walking over with quick, deliberate steps, one hand raised and one hand moving to the radio clipped to his vest. The old man did not run. He did not reach for an apology. He did not look around at the crowd or at the police officer now closing in behind him. He kept his eyes on the guard, fixed, unblinking, as if willing the young man to look back at him. As if everything depended on it, the guard still did not move. By the time the officer reached him and placed a firm hand on his shoulder, the old man let out a sound, not a cry exactly, and not a shout, something in between, something broken and raw. Like a sound that had been trapped inside a person for a very long time and had finally found a way out. His knees softened, his shoulders dropped, and the officer, clearly expecting a fight, was caught off guard when the old man did not resist at all. He simply leaned forward slightly, as if the hand on his shoulder was the only thing keeping standing. The crowd watched all of it unfold in stunned silence. Phones were filming. Children were asking questions that their parents could not answer. The tour guide, still frozen, had not picked up her rehearsed speech again. And through it all, the royal guard stood exactly where he had been standing. Eyes forward, posture straight, coffee drying into the front of his uniform, still as stone. Still as a man who had been trained to feel nothing, to show nothing, to give nothing away. But one thing was true that nobody in the crowd knew yet. The old man and the guard were not strangers, and what had brought them to that pavement on that cold November morning was not madness, and not malice, and not the kind of reckless disrespect the crowd had already decided it was. It was something far older, far quieter. and far more painful than any of them could have imagined, standing there behind their cameras, shaking their heads, already forming their judgments about a man they knew absolutely nothing about. The truth would come out. It always does. But it would not come easily, and it would not come quickly. And when it finally did come, it would leave the people who had been quickest to judge him standing in a silence of a very different kind. His name was Arthur Henley, and he had not slept in 3 days. Not really slept. Not the kind of sleep where your body forgets its weight, and your mind goes quiet, and you wake up feeling like a person again. He had dozed in chairs, drifted off with his coat still on, jolted awake in the middle of the night, reaching for a phone that lit up with nothing. 3 days of that. 3 days of sitting in a flat that felt too big and too quiet, and too full of things that belonged to a life that had quietly collapsed around him over the last 2 years without him fully realizing it until it was already gone. Arthur had grown up in Coventry, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. The kind of childhood that was not rich in money, but was rich in certainty. The certainty that people showed up, that families held together, that if you worked hard and kept your word and loved the people in your life properly, things would be all right. He had believed that for most of his 64 years. He had held on to it the way some people hold on to a railing in bad weather, not because they are weak, but because the wind is strong. He had married young. Catherine, bright eyes, quick laugh, the sort of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and made strangers feel like old friends within 10 minutes of meeting them. They had a son together, Daniel, and for a long time, the three of them were exactly what Arthur had believed a family should be. Sunday dinners, school plays, holidays on the Norfolk coast where it always rained but nobody minded, the kind of ordinary life that does not feel ordinary at all when you are inside it. It feels like the most precious thing in the world once it is gone. The cracks started when Daniel was 15. They were small at first, a sharpness in conversations, a door closed too hard, a silence at the dinner table that stretched longer than it used to. Arthur was working long hours at that time, managing a warehouse outside the city, trying to hold together a job that was slowly getting harder as the industry changed around him. He told himself the tension with Daniel was normal. He told himself teenage boys were difficult by nature. He told himself he would have more time soon, and that soon he would sit down with his son and really talk, really listen, really close the distance that had opened up between them. He kept telling himself that for too long. By the time Daniel was 18, the distance had become a wall. Arthur could no longer name exactly when it had been built, or whose hands had done the most building, because the truth was it had gone up brick by brick over years, with contributions from both of them, silence on one side, stubbornness on the other, pride doing what pride always does, which is convince you that waiting is the same thing as wisdom. Catherine had tried to pull them back together. She had tried for years, quietly and then loudly, and then with a desperation that Arthur only recognized in hindsight. He had not tried hard enough. He knew that now with a clarity that arrived too late to do anything useful with Catherine died 18 months ago. A stroke, sudden and without warning, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. She was 61 years old. She had been planning a trip to Portugal for the following spring. Her death did something too. Arthur that he did not have words for. It did not just take her, it took the version of himself that had existed alongside her. The version that still had time, still had chances, still had tomorrows lined up in a neat and reliable row. It made every unfinished thing feel urgent in a way that was almost unbearable. The words he had never said, the apologies he had put off, the conversation with Daniel that he had been postponing for years, always certain there would be a better moment, always certain the right moment was just around the next corner. He had tried to reach Daniel after the funeral. Calls that went unanswered. A letter that he had no way of knowing had been read. A message through a mutual cousin that came back with nothing but the information that Daniel was doing fine and was busy with work. Daniel had joined the military at 19. Another thing that had happened while Arthur was not paying close enough attention. Another thing he had heard about secondhand. Another gap in the story of his son's life that he had no right to feel hurt by but felt hurt by anyway. He had not seen his son in 6 years. And then, 3 weeks ago, while scrolling through a local news article he had barely been paying attention to, he had stopped on a photograph. A group of soldiers in ceremonial uniform, standing outside Buckingham Palace for a rotation ceremony. Arthur had leaned in close to the screen, his reading glasses on, his heart doing something strange in his chest. He had looked at the face of the tallest soldier in the back row for a very long time, and then he had sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for almost an hour. It was Daniel, his son, standing guard at the palace. Straight-backed and serious-faced and looking more like a man than Arthur had been prepared for. Looking strong. Looking fine. Looking like someone who had built a whole life in the years. His father had spent waiting for the right moment to reach out. Arthur had written down the address of the palace. He had checked the guard rotation times online. He had taken a train from Coventry to London on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee from the station kiosk and no clear plan except to go there. To stand at those gates, to see his son, even from a distance, to find some way to cross the wall that should have come down years ago. He had not meant to throw the coffee. That part had not been planned at all. The video was online within 20 minutes. Someone, in the crowd, a young woman named Priya, who had been visiting London for a conference, and had stopped at the palace purely by accident, had been recording. On her phone when it happened, her clip was only 47 seconds long, but it caught everything. The throw. The impact. The coffee spreading dark and steaming across the red uniform. The guard's absolute stillness. The old man's trembling hands. And that sound, that broken, raw sound he made, when the officer's hand landed on his shoulder, picked up clearly by the phone microphone. Unmistakable even beneath the noise of the crowd. Priya had uploaded it without thinking too hard about it, the way people do in the age of instant sharing. And within the hour it had been reposted hundreds of times. By afternoon it had tens of thousands of views. Comments flooded in. Most of them were angry. Words like disgraceful and disgusting appeared over and over. People called for charges, for consequences, for the old man to be named and shamed. A few people noted that the guard's composure was extraordinary and made comments about the strength of his training. One popular comment simply said, "That soldier deserves a medal." Nobody in those comments, in those first hours, asked why. Back at the palace gates, the scene had moved quickly from shock to procedure. The police officer, Constable Mark Webb, who had been on duty that stretch of pavement for 4 years and had seen a fair amount of strange behavior but nothing quite like this, had the old man in a firm but calm grip and was speaking to him in the low, measured tone they teach you to use when a situation could go either way. Arthur was not resisting. He was barely responding. He looked, Webb would later say in his report, like a man who had run a very long race and had finally emerged. Completely stopped, they moved him away from the gates, down the pavement, around a corner, away from the cameras and the crowd, and into the temporary shelter of a police vehicle. Webb sat with him while a second officer took details. Arthur gave his name, his address, his age. Each answer came slowly, like words being pulled up from somewhere deep. When Webb asked him, as gently as the circumstances allowed, why he had done it, Arthur looked at him for a long moment, and then looked out the window at the gray sky and said nothing at all. Meanwhile, the guard himself, Daniel Henley, 25 years old, 3 years into his service as a member of the Household Cavalry, had completed the rest of his shift with the same precision and silence that had made the video remarkable in the first place. He had not looked at the man. He had not broken. He had done what he was trained to do, which was stand as a symbol, not as a person, not as a son, not as someone carrying his own private history, but as a symbol of something larger than any one moment. And he had done it extraordinarily well. But when his shift ended and he went inside, stripped off the coffee-stained tunic, and handed it to a colleague without comment, something in his expression made the colleague pause. Not grief exactly. Not anger. Something quieter and harder to read. Something that had briefly crossed his face before he put it away. The same way he had learned to put everything away cleanly, quickly. Without making a scene, his supervising officer called him aside before he could leave. A formality, he explained. There was an incident report to complete. The man had been taken in. Did Daniel know him? Was there any connection he needed to disclose? The question landed like a stone in still water. Daniel said no. He said it without hesitation. The way soldiers learn to say difficult things, with a flat face and a steady voice and a posture that gives nothing away. And his officer nodded and wrote something down and told him to get some rest. That he had handled himself well today, that his conduct had been exemplary. Daniel thanked him and walked out into the gray afternoon and stood for a moment in the cold air. Very still, the way he had been standing all morning, except that now there was no duty holding him in place. Now it was something else entirely. Back at the station, Constable Webb had made Arthur a cup of tea, not out of regulation, but out of something more human, and sat across from him in a small room with a table and 2 plastic chairs. Arthur had his hands wrapped around the mug. He had not drunk from it. He was staring at the surface of the tea the way people stare at things when they are not really seeing them. Constable Webb did not follow protocol for the next 30 minutes. Protocol would have meant processing the incident, charging Arthur with a public order offense, moving things through the system in the orderly, documented way that systems are designed for. All of that was still going to happen. But first, Webb sat in that small room with the plastic chairs and the lukewarm tea, and he listened to Arthur Henley talk. He listened for a long time. He had a son of his own, 19 years old, studying in Edinburgh. Someone he texted every few days in that careful, slightly awkward way that fathers text sons when they are not sure how much contact is welcome. He listened with that fact quietly present in the back of his mind the whole time. Arthur told him about Catherine, about how she had been the bridge between him and Daniel for years, the one who softened his silences, who translated his stubbornness into something Daniel could understand, who kept the family connected through the sheer force of her love and her effort, and her refusal to let people she cared about drift apart without a fight. He told Webb how losing her had been like losing the one person who had been holding 2 separated pieces of something together, and how without her, he had not known how to reach across the gap on his own. He told him about the photograph in the newspaper, about sitting in the flat recognizing his son's face after 6 years, about the weeks of sitting with that knowledge, trying to decide what to do, drafting messages he never sent, picking up the phone and putting it down, telling himself that Daniel had a right to his distance, that showing up uninvited was not the same as making things right, that maybe the kindest thing he could do was leave well enough alone. And then Arthur went quiet for a moment and looked down at the mug and said the thing that explained everything, the thing that had finally made the decision for him when nothing else could. 6 weeks ago, he had been diagnosed with cancer, pancreatic, advanced. The doctor had used words like palliative and timeline and comfortable, all of which were polite ways of saying that the time Arthur had assumed he had, the safe, open-ended time that he had been spending on postponement and waiting, was no longer available. He had months, the doctor said, possibly less. He was not going to die next week, but he was not going to be well enough to travel and think clearly and carry himself like a person for very much longer either. He had used up his time, and now he was at the end of it, standing at the edge of the thing he had been putting off. And the whole architecture of excuses he had built around his silence had collapsed all at once. Because none of it, not the pride, not the awkwardness, not the fear of being turned away, none of it mattered anymore next to the simple, terrible fact that he was running out of chances to say the things he needed to say to his son. He had not planned to throw the coffee. He wanted Webb to understand that. He had stood at those gates for almost an hour, watching Daniel stand at his post. And something had happened to him, something that he could not fully explain and did not fully understand. Seeing Daniel there, that close, looking so capable and composed and fine without him, something had broken open in Arthur's chest that he had been keeping closed for years. The coffee had been in his hand. His hands had started shaking, and in one moment of pure, uncontrolled desperation, the kind of desperation that comes when you are staring at a closing window and you know it, not to hurt it, not to hurt, not to humiliate. Not out of anger, though it had looked like anger from the outside, which he understood. He had thrown it because he needed Daniel to look at him. Because 6 years of silence and letters and unanswered calls and secondhand messages had not worked. And he was standing 20 feet from his son with a terminal diagnosis in his coat pocket and no other idea left in him. He needed his son to see him. To know he was there. To know that he had come all this way. Webb did not speak for a while after Arthur finished. The room was very quiet. Through the wall, somewhere further down the corridor, a phone rang twice and stopped. Then Webb asked Arthur a question that was not on any form, that had no box to be ticked beside it, that was not part of any procedure he'd been trained in. He asked, "If I could make sure your son heard what you just told me, would you want that?" Arthur looked at him. For the first time since they had brought him in, his eyes were fully present, not glazed, not distant, not cowl. The door opened 40 minutes later, and Daniel walked in. He was out of uniform, plain clothes. A gray jacket, nothing that marked him as the composed, an untouchable figure who had stood at the palace gates that morning. He looked younger without it. He looked in the dim light of the corridor, very much like a young man who had received news he had been trying not to receive for a long time, and was still deciding what to do with his face. Webb stepped out, quietly and closed the door behind him. What happened in that room and the next hour was not witnessed by anyone except Arthur and Daniel. Nobody filmed it. Nobody wrote it up in an official report. It belonged entirely to the two of them, the way the things that matter most almost always do. What is known came later, in fragments, from what each of them chose to share over the weeks and months that followed. From what Webb had observed in the minutes immediately before and after, from the way Daniel looked when he came back out into the corridor, not put together, not composed, not the way a man looks when he has successfully kept his guard in place. From the way Arthur looked when they finally discharged him with a caution and a duty of care referral and a handshake from Webb that lasted a little longer than handshakes usually do, what is known is that Daniel had read the letter Arthur sent after Catherine's funeral. He had read it more than once. He had drafted a reply 3 separate times and not sent any of them, not out of not caring, but out of a kind of emotional paralysis that people who have been hurt deeply and quietly for a long time will recognize. The fear that reaching back would mean reopening everything. The fear that forgiving would mean pretending the damage had not been real. The exhausting, circular grief of wanting something and being afraid of it at the same time. What is known is that when Daniel came out of that room, he sat with his father for another 30 minutes in the small corridor outside. On a bench near a window, with a view of nothing much, just a brick wall and a strip of November sky, they sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Neither of them smiled much. It was not that kind of conversation, but neither of them left. The video by this point had reached millions of views. The narrative online was still largely the same: shock, outrage, admiration for the guard's composure. A few outlets had picked it up as a news item. The guard's professionalism was being widely praised. The old man had become a byword for disrespectful tourist behavior. The comment sections were full of people who were absolutely certain about what they had seen, and absolutely certain about what it meant. 2 weeks after the incident, Constable Webb, with full permission from both Arthur and Daniel, spoke to a journalist he trusted. Not a sensational outlet, not someone looking for clicks. Someone who he believed would tell the story the way it deserved to be told. The article ran on a Saturday morning, and it told everything: the diagnosis, the years of silence, the photograph in the newspaper, the train from Coventry, the moment of unplanned desperation at the palace gates. It told it plainly and without exaggeration. And it ended with the simple fact that a father and a son who had not spoken in 6 years had sat together on a bench in a police corridor and begun, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal still unresolved between them, the work of finding their way back to each other. The reaction was not what anyone expected. The same comment sections that had erupted with anger went quiet, then filled again differently. People who had called Arthur disgusting wrote follow-up comments that were harder to write and more important for having been written. Priya, the woman whose video had started everything, posted her own message saying she was glad she had been wrong about what she thought she was seeing. A man in Bristol wrote that the story had made him call his own father for the first time in 4 years, and that they had talked for 2 hours, and that he did not know yet how things would go, but that at least they were talking. Arthur received a minor caution for the incident. No criminal record. No further consequences. The palace made no official comment, which in itself was quietly gracious. Daniel continued his service without disruption. They did not fix everything in that corridor. Because 6 years of distance and grief and pride do not get fixed in a corridor. They get worked on slowly. In phone calls and visits and shared silences and small moments of choosing to show up when it would be easier not to. But they were working on it. That was the part that mattered. Arthur's illness progressed through the winter. Some weeks were harder than others. Daniel visited him in Coventry twice before Christmas, stayed overnight the second time, slept in the room that had been his as a teenager, and that Arthur had never changed. They did not talk about all of it. They talked around some of it, and through some of it, and over some of it, in the way that real reconciliation works, not in one clean cathartic moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary time spent together, two people learning again how to be in the same room, without the weight of everything, unsaid, crushing the air out of it. The crowd outside the palace. Gates had seen a strange and unsettling thing on a cold November morning. They had seen an old man in a wrinkled coat do something impulsive and wrong. They had seen a guard stand like stone in the face of it. They had made their judgments quickly, the way crowds always do, the way people do when they see a single frame of a story and mistake it for the whole picture. What they had not seen, what none of us see, most of the time, and the people around us, was the 6 years leading up to that one moment. The grief, the fear. The terminal diagnosis folded into a coat pocket. The desperate, irrational, very human act of a man who had run out of time and out of options and out of every polite and appropriate way of reaching the person he loved, and who had done the only thing left he could think of. He had thrown the coffee. And his son had looked at him, and the crowd had been left speechless, first by the shock of it, and then, when the truth came out, by something much harder and much more lasting than shock, by the recognition of themselves in it.